Hello world and welcome to the 8th episode of What Does This Knob Do? As promised, I'll introduce you today to oscillators from developers from M to N. I also make up for a module that was somehow not displayed as an oscillator in the module browser. I will start with this one too. I introduced Chip Your Wave from Baker Music, but Chip Waves slipped through. Developer Paul Walker also shows his enthusiasm for chip sound with this oscillator. He simulates the sound generation of the NES. Triangle and pulse wave are provided. Triangle wave is stepped and therefore lo-fi, and the width of the pulse wave can be set in 4 steps with a duty cycle control. The frequency range reaches into the LFO range. I measured 11.6 Hz, and with the triangle wave up to F6 and the pulse wave up to F8. And then there is a volt per octave input, and that's it. One of the most diligent and innovative module developers in VCV-Rack is MSC Hack. I have to admit, at first the design of the modules kept me from trying them out. But behind the simple, almost child-friendly facade, some real treasures are hidden. First of all, we have the OSC3. At first glance, he seems to be missing a lot. But he has other things that aren't actually in an oscillator. In principle, it consists of 3 identical oscillators. Everyone has the usual volt per octave input, a trigger input, which must have a signal in any case, otherwise nothing will happen. In addition, both filter cutoff, resonance and volume can be controlled by CV. The filter is already the first special feature because this is usually an extra module, not with the OSC3. And the filter can be used as low pass, high pass, band pass, and notch filters or off. And as already mentioned, cutoff frequency and resonance are controllable. Each oscillator offers the 4 basic waveforms: sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth plus white noise. Only one waveform at a time can be output per oscillator. A simple envelope generator with attack, decay and release is also integrated to trigger the envelope, and that's why the trigger pulse is required. The sound of each oscillator consists of up to 7 identical part waveforms. With N waves, you set their number. With detune, they are detuned against each other, which we know from the E-Series cloud generator. There it is the task of the spread button. Here, spread is responsible for delimiting the partials to each other. Far left is a clear demarcation. Turning the knob further to the right, the transitions are always softer or more fluent. With each waveform, however, this effect is perceivably differently. A very interesting kind of sound shaping. Each oscillator has 2 outputs. Since these are labeled with left and right, that means probably that it can be operated in stereo, which indeed makes sense because of the spread. Unfortunately, there are no master functions for the whole module, i.e. volt per octave global, master volume and sum output. But of course, everything can be improvised, that's why it does not matter so much. More serious, however, is the lack of opportunity to tune the oscillator. The pitch must therefore be determined by the input signal, or you generally use it for bass passages. Sonically, he is almost predestined for this. An interesting oscillator with some possibilities. With the wave morph oscillator, we can once again paint our own waveform and thereby generate virtually any waveform, provided that 17 steps of coordinates are sufficient. Where coordinates are not quite correct because the values of the x-axis are fixed and only the y-axis can be shifted in a range of ±6 volts, whereby always the instantaneous value of a point can be seen. Nevertheless, a lot can be started with it. With draw, you can activate the draw mode, and with a rubber band, how much the neighboring dots are influenced by the drawing. For a quick overview, I'd recommend clicking on the rand button, which WaveMorph will provide right away. This all looks like business development or a temperature scale, but is a complex, randomly generated waveform. If that's too coincidental, you will also find a few presets and hear old acquaintances like a square wave, a sine, a cosine, a kind of mixture of sawtooth and sine wave, a pure sawtooth, a phase-shifted sawtooth, and a pure signal with ±6 volts and 0 volts. By clicking on Invert, any waveform, even self-generated or random, can be inverted. With the button Copy, you can copy a waveform into one of the 3 WaveMorph oscillators. This one selects over 1, 2, 3, and the output signal always corresponds to the volts of the input signal at the morph input. If I switch the oscillator to solo, only the tuned oscillator with a corresponding waveform will sound. In this mode, with a CV signal at the input change, also the choice of the oscillator can be automated. Both trigger and gate signals are possible. So we never get mixed signal from all 3 oscillators. The 3 oscillators alone can also be activated by -10 volts for oscillator 1, 0 volts for oscillator 2 and +10 volts for oscillator 3 at the input morph. If I enter -5 volts, I get the same mixture of oscillator 1 and 2. If I enter 2 volts, the output signal consists of 80% oscillator 2 and 20% oscillator 3. Of course, finer subdivisions are also possible and can therefore be morphed through the waveforms with a changing input signal, e.g. by LFO or envelope. From light beating to total chaos, everything is possible. Depending on which waveforms I choose and which modulator. The output volume is set with level, and this can be controlled by CV. We also find the same filter here as in the OSC3, so I do not go into it here. But with this one I can edit the waveforms very nicely. I recommend using an oscilloscope when working with a wavemorph to see what you are doing and see all the changes. Again, the lack of pitch adjustment is noticeable, but this oscillator is pleasingly different. Pleasingly different also applies to the next three modules of MSC Hack. They look similar and work similar, so I trade them together. We are talking about aliens, drones and winds. I have no idea if they are intended for specific sound design. I see here rather the random sound generation, but in this they are quite big. If not everything deceives me, there are 4,294,967,296 ways to combine the 32 seats, because everyone can have the state on and off, i.e. 2 to the power of 32. So in principle you could do targeted sound design, but for that it would be necessary to try all combinations, because each combination, even if only of 2 seats, has a different result. Their exact code can be read and remembered for reuse. Or you can simply save the preset and reload it if necessary. But I found out that the seats of the 5th row are all variations of the pitch A, but with different modulations or overtones. The internal modulation, which is permanently linked to each seat, is a filter modulation a la wah-wah, and its speed is set with a yellow control between 0.1 and 8. So both positive and negative modulations are possible. And in the middle position at 1 there is no modulation. The random button in the middle of the modules is very prominent, and as I said, here I can see they are used. Especially since this can also be triggered. Drones also has a volt per octave input, and this should be used. Then the drone sounds really come into their own. Because that's what drones is for, and that's what he's doing great for. Winds has no volt per octave input. It simply generates different types of noise and combines them into wind noise. And here to the speed of modulation can be controlled, and the random generation of the combinations can be triggered. Drones and winds are stereo designed. Aliens is only mono and has a gate input instead of volt per octave. Here you can, of course, introduce a modulation source, but also external signals such as another oscillator, perhaps even drones. Aliens seats are all special effects and would have fit wonderfully on board of the Enterprise. And just in the combination of the modules are extremely wacky things possible. These 3 oscillators are certainly not intended for everyday use, although I can often imagine drones, but they are absolute specialists when it comes to special effects. You can't usually do them that easily. The next oscillator fits again very well into the category basic. It's the Rogue from MSM. At this point I have to highlight the manual, which is really fantastic and contains all previous modules of MSM and perfectly answers the question, what does this knob do? Nevertheless, I introduced the modules of MSM, of course, equal rights for all. Okay, the Rogue has some features of the VCO1 from Fundamental, which is always my reference. It has the same range from ±4 octaves and fine-tuning ±3 semitone steps. It can be switched from analog to digital waveform, and for further consideration, I now also use the digital waveform. Here we see that the digital waveform is cleaner but not perfect, and therefore still has a slight analog character. It offers the possibility of frequency modulation, but even has two modes, linear and exponential, with extra inputs and controllers. It has a volt per octave input and a reset socket with which the waveform can be reset and restarted via trigger. In principle, a gate signal is also possible here, but the reset is only triggered if the threshold is exceeded. At waveforms ramp, an inverted sawtooth wave, sine, triangle, sawtooth and square are available, whereby the pulse width of the square wave can be controlled manually and by CV. In addition, there are also two waveforms that correspond to a rectified sine. One represents the full waveform and is output at FWRS, and the other only half of the waveform, and this is applied at HWRS. And as if that wasn't enough, the oscillator can also be operated as an LFO. In any case, an interesting variant of the VCO1. The next oscillator could be described as Rogue's big brother. Basically, the OSC-EX consists of two Rogues, but without the rectified sine waves. But it has the waveform fold, but more about that later. Both oscillators can be synchronized with each other by switch in both directions, i.e. oscillator A with oscillator B and vice versa, and even both, which creates a synchronization loop, and synchronization can even be controlled by CV. Both oscillators have their own controls for linear and exponential frequency modulation, and these can even be operated without CV, which allows really great sounds. But of course, there is also an input jack for CV control. The FM index control selects the frequencies to be influenced for the FM of both oscillators, and this can also be controlled via CV. Oscillator A generates the waveforms sine, triangle and sawtooth. Oscillator B, sine, square and fold, whereby the pulse width of the square wave can be determined with the PW controller and controlled by CV. Let's get to fold. This output remains mute first if it is occupied. With fold index, you generate a waveform and determine its amplitude. This can also be done via CV. This waveform already contains a first convolution. Further convolution is done with a fold control. The more folds, the more chaotic the signal becomes and sometimes sounds metallic. The fold CV input with the corresponding control is assigned to the fold control, i.e. the number of folds can also be dynamically controlled. The folding can take place from bottom to top and vice versa. The degree of folding from which direction is set using the up and down knobs. CV inputs are also available for this. Finally, it is also possible to insert an external signal and fold it. All in all, the OSC-EX is extremely versatile and easier to use than you would expect from its possibilities. All that remains is that all MSM modules have both a light and a dark design. Let's get to stranger things. That's all I can call strange attractors from Nomad. First, I had to get to know what the Lorentz and Rössler attractors were, and honestly, I didn't understand much about them. It is generally a stretch-fold operation. These can be calculated mathematically with corresponding variables and can therefore also be displayed. In Lissajous mode of JW modules full scope, you can see them very nicely. Each attractor has an X and a Y coordinate, and these are output at the corresponding outputs. An input signal can be introduced into pitch, and the pitch can also be adjusted, at least to some extent. Because the other controllers determine the variables of the respective equation. Lorentz has the variables sigma, beta and rho, Rössler A, B and C. If at Lorentz all controls are at the left stop and the pitch control is in the middle position, we have a kind of sine to which frequencies are randomly added and removed again. If everything doesn't fool me, sigma adds low frequencies by stretching the waveform. Beta adds medium frequencies and folds them, and rho adds high frequencies. The further the knobs are turned up, the more equal frequencies are generated and overlap. Partly they are added, partly they cancel each other out. The result is a bipolar signal with randomly changing amplitudes and frequencies, which can become very chaotic, but also generates regular waveforms by selectively adding and removing frequencies. Rössler is a little easier to grasp. If all controllers are on the left, we have an even sine wave with the frequency 234.83 Hz. Regulator A compresses the shaft, which slightly increases the frequency and additionally every second amplitude. Interestingly, the signal at output Y is mirror inverted to output X. Controller B stretches the signal again, making it more regular again, but the frequency decreases again. Knob C distorts the signal by adding overtones, increasing and decreasing individual amplitudes more or less regularly. The further the slider is turned to the right, the more chaotic the waveform is. But it repeats itself again and again and basically always remains a sine wave. That's my subjective view of the strange attractors. I think you should just try it out here, and it certainly doesn't hurt to see the corresponding Lissajous graphic. Strange attractors is certainly not a bread and butter oscillator, but it has its appeal just as surely. Also, the quadratic iterator from nonlinear instruments is anything but commonplace, as the name suggests. Roughly speaking, iteration is a mathematical procedure in which the result of a calculation serves as the basis for the next calculation, and this is repeated until one has an almost valid result. We are here in the basics of chaos theory, and with this procedure one wants to predict chaotic processes. This is certainly not the task of this module, but the term above the big button tells us that it's all about chaos. This is also the only parameter that can be changed. In this module, two iterators work, and the result of their calculations is output at the outputs x and y. The chaos button defines the parameter r in the programmed equation I don't know what value the developer has set for x of n, but usually it is between 0 and 1. Mathematical calculations have shown that chaos starts at a value of r greater than 3.5, so the controller starts with that. The more it is turned up, the more chaotic the signal becomes. When the offset controller is closed, R is the same for both iterators. If you move it to the left, the second iterator gets a different R. The strength of this deviation is determined with the offset control. And so that the chaos does not remain static, the value for R can also be controlled by CV. The intensity of this modulation is determined with the CV-C controller. What do we do with it now? Together with an envelope generator and a good filter, you can do a lot with it, from melodic to percussive. But here's a real challenge. Let's see if the NIST modules are also such a challenge. At least they have many controls. And I have to admit that scared me off at the beginning, and Antonio Tuzzi is just so busy to release at least one new module every week that you can hardly keep up. Alright. Challenge accepted. Let's start with the deep note generator. He first welcomes us by clicking on Start with a swelling chord, which I have heard somewhere before. Yes, THX. After that he's mute. Next to the Start button is an input. Let's see what happens if you introduce a volt per octave signal here. Nothing. Obviously, this is a gate trigger input. After hours of experimenting, I asked Antonio Tuzzi, the head behind NIST, who explained that 51 VCOs and 150 envelopes are running internally, and he is not to be used as normal VCO, only as basic material for sampling. Well, that takes me further. Okay, there was a module of NIST among the oscillators which processes samples. But the quad sampler is only a sample player, but its big brother, the complex sampler, can also sample itself. Since sampling is not our topic today, I did it in the background and already loaded the file into the quad sampler. We'll get to that in a moment. First of all, I'm still at the deep note generator, and so I'm not giving up using it elsewhere. I let myself be carried away to the saying that you can create drums with every module, so why not with this one as well? The THX sound has a rather long attack time, and also the duration is not exactly short, and therefore we have adjustment possibilities, exactly like for 4 frequency ranges. As usual with NIST, click on the number you want to change and move the mouse up or down. With several deep notes and different triggers like e.g. the topograph of valley, you can do quite a bit, and I just decided that I will do it in the very cool patch contest number 10. So if you want to know what I'm doing with the deep note generator, you should check out my video. Here I continue with the quad sampler, which I already fed with the sound of the deep note. As already mentioned, the quad sampler is a sample player, and as you can see, and as the name suggests, you can play 4 samples at the same time, which is remarkable in itself. All 4 units are identically constructed. First of all, we have the white field. Here, of course, the sample should be inserted, and this can be done simply by right-clicking and selecting the slot to be equipped. This will open a window to select the WAV or AIFF file. It couldn't be simpler. Once the sample is loaded, you can see its waveform in the display and start it by clicking trick. Immediately, a blue bar starts to race back and forth and does not stop until you click either gate or one shot. In gate mode, it waits for a gate signal at the trigger input and plays the sample as long as the gate signal continues. Pressing or holding the trigger button repeatedly also has the same effect. In one-shot mode, the sample is played once as soon as a trigger signal is received or the button is pressed. Holding the button is useless, and with a gate signal, the sample is triggered only once as soon as a voltage is applied. Just 1 volt is enough. As soon as the trigger signal arrives at a stop input, the sample is stopped. It is therefore possible to play back the sample for a desired time using trigger signals. This trigger signal can also be triggered internally via the EOC end of cycle output. When the cycle of one sample ends, the other is activated when the EOC of one unit is connected to the trigger in of another. This allows the samples of the 4 units to be played back automatically one after the other. Start CV is assigned to the start slider, which sets the start point within the sample. The CV input can also be moved dynamically and automatically, e.g. with an LFO or an envelope. The green bar always indicates where the starting point is. The FM controller only works when a control voltage is applied to the corresponding input and controls the sampling speed of the sample. These can be set manually with a speed control, whereby in the initialized position the original speed of the sample is applied, and with a clockwise direction the speed increases and decreases counterclockwise. In the center position the speed is 0, and to the left of the center position the sample is played backwards. With pan you can of course adjust the panorama, and each unit has its own output. But of course there is also a common stereo output. And if you want to add more samples, e.g. more quad simplers, to the stereo signal, you can use the chain mixer control with its 2 inputs. The quad simpler impresses by its simplicity. It is a simple sample player and doesn't want to be any more. Therefore, there is probably no way to define the start and end point within the sample. This can be improvised via a trigger pulse at the stop input, or you can use the Big Brother complex sampler, which can do that. In the LFO multiphase, I first thought it accidentally slipped into the oscillators. Then I saw the ×10 switch in the frequency range. As LFO, it goes from 0 to 10 Hz, ×10 to 100 Hz. And that is G2. And with an extremely fast trigger like the 3840 BPM of JW module's clock, we get to 640 Hz. Because with a tap trick you can set the frequency depending on the speed of the trigger, either by clicking on tap as fast as you want it to be, or by introducing a trigger signal. The same applies to the sync input. Usually it is used to synchronize 2 oscillators, so I can insert the signal of another oscillator and its frequency controls the modulation of the module. But you can also simply click on the tap sync field at the desired speed. The LFO multiphase generates the 4 fundamental waveforms: sine, triangle, sawtooth and square, whereby with a corresponding controller it is possible to change continuously from one to the other. This can also be controlled by CV, but here you can not only adjust the modulation intensity, but also whether the transition between the waveforms should be smooth or choppy, with a switch, discrete, morph. With Uni-B, you switch between a unipolar and bipolar signal. The fine-tuning is actually very fine here, because it is not even a half step up and down. FM in together with a corresponding controller is not only the usual frequency modulation, but also the volt per octave input of the module when the controller is turned up completely, as we already know from the Autodafé modules. The PW, PWM knobs and the corresponding input socket determine the pulse width of the waveforms and act on all waveforms. This separation between fixed pulse width and pulse width modulation makes it possible to create very interesting and lively sounds, especially through the various available phases. 8 fixed and 1 freely definable phase are available. while the shifted phase without pulse width modulation is mainly optically detectable, or, of course, if you use several phases at the same time. Adding the PWM results in different waveforms and sounds. The angle of the free phase can be adjusted manually or controlled by CV. The amount of modulation can be set using the free mod slider. So I have to say, this module has positively surprised me. The sound and the variety of sounds is much bigger than I thought, and I can imagine it very well in the area of bass sounds. But also experimental sounds in higher pitches can certainly be realized by the tap functions. Speaking of experimental, the Phaser Harmonic VCO scared me when I first saw it. Series after series of inputs, outputs and knobs, and then the graphics in the display. Even the candy colors are of no use. Fortunately, he looks more dangerous than he is. Above all, we can simply hide individual elements, which I will do for now. Phaser has two different context menus, depending on where you right-click. In the side areas, the usual menu appears, which all VCV-Rack modules have. But if you click in the middle, many options appear, which can be set or which determine the behavior of Phaser. I deactivate Show Phaser, Show Path and Show Wave one after the other by removing the check mark with a left click, and the graphic is hidden. Alternatively, you can simply switch on the low power mode. Now click on Full Reset and we have a simple sine wave with a frequency 65.41 Hz, which is also shown in the base frequency Hertz display. This corresponds to a C2, and therefore Phaser is tuned 2 octaves lower than standard oscillators from the beginning. By changing the value in the display, simply click on the number to be changed and then move it up or down with the mouse. I get value ranges from 16.35 Hz to 261.33 Hz, i.e. C0 to C4, and with the octave control I can still detune plus minus 2 octaves. So we get up to C6 and down to the absolute LFO range. And there are dedicated outputs for that, but more about that later. The octave can also be detuned by CV. For frequency modulation, there are two options, linear and exponential, and both have their own controller and input, and can therefore be used simultaneously. CV is the usual volt per octave input here. Phaser has 16 oscillators, each with 2 outputs, one for the normal signal and one for the LFO signal. The latter does not work in low power mode, so it makes sense to hide the graphic elements individually. Both output signals can also be used simultaneously because they actually each have an oscillator. And by left clicking on the plus, this is closed, and minus tells us this frequency is inverted. The sign is called frequency sign and can also be set randomly, but more about this later. The red line in the display represents 1 volt and is important for the setting magnitude, in principle the volume of the selected frequency. This can be between minus and plus 2 and can easily be changed by left clicking and then moving up or down. This can also be controlled by CV. The magnitude CV attempt slider is used to adjust the amount of modulation, which can be positive or negative. With phase, the phase of the overtone can be set between 0 and 330 degrees or controlled dynamically via the phase CV input. With frequency trim, the frequency of a harmonic can be shifted by plus-minus 20% to achieve enharmonic effects. This can also be controlled by CV, and the strength is adjustable via the trim attenuator. Here too a negative signal is possible, so that the attenuator should actually be called an attenuator, smartest mode off. Before we turn to the right side of the module, let's have a look at the context menu, because that's really something. While initialize, as usual, resets the entire module, full reset resets only the center area. The next settings only make sense if more than one oscillator is working, so I click on Randomize all magnitudes. Again, Phaser differs from other modules because it has different modes for random selections. In the standard context menu, a random setting can of course also be generated for the entire module. In the basic setting, the harmonics are tuned normally, i.e., the first harmonic comes next to the fundamental, so at C2 this is C3, which corresponds to a doubling of the frequency. The second harmonic is then the basic frequency times 3, and so on. With Phaser, however, I can increase the interval between the frequencies to square, i.e. fundamental times 4, 2 to the power of 2, corresponds to the first harmonic, and fundamental times 9, 3 to the power of 2 to the second, and so on. But that's not all. Cubic also goes up times 8 times 27, and square root times 1.41 times 1.73. This alone can generate an enormous amount of different sounds. We already had a low power mode. With frequency trimmers as FM inputs, you can realize a separate frequency modulation for each oscillator or each harmonic. For the next option, I activate the 3 elements of the graphic again. Zoom out reduces the graphic, zoom in enlarges it, and with zoom reset I have the initial value again. We know from the additive synthesis that any waveform can be generated with sine waves of different frequencies and amplitudes. Phaser takes advantage of this fact and therefore offers presets for the waveforms sawtooth, square and triangle, which can be selected with reset saw, reset square and reset triangle. What random KS is all about, we'll come to that later. As already mentioned, various elements of Phaser can be created individually at random, magnitude, phase, frequency trimmer, and frequency sign. Each of these elements can also be reset individually to 0 or, in the case of frequency sign, to the starting position. If you right-click in the field directly over a magnitude attenuator, you have the option to set the magnitude to full, half, or 0, and to change the corresponding sign. If you need to go to the bathroom, have a drink or a smoke, now's a good time. Which we come to the final spurt. To see what tilt does, I first choose one of the fundamental waveforms, the sawtooth. Controller in the middle position always means that positive and negative values can be set. Turned clockwise, high frequencies are raised. The higher the frequency, the greater the effect. Turned counterclockwise, the same happens at low frequencies. This can be automated with tilt CV and the control voltage at the corresponding input. If the tilt controlled is in the center position, you can use tilt CV to switch between the emphasized frequencies. Offset shifts all harmonics up or down, i.e. increases or decreases the amplitudes, which also changes the ratio of the partials within the overall sound. This is why strong offset values are also noticeable by a change in sound. This can also be controlled by CV, where only values are added, i.e. the offset is either positive or negative, but not alternately. And as promised, I'll tell you what random KFs is all about. Let's take a look at the keyframe animator, which is a very powerful tool. Initially, it shows a green 0 in the KF count display because it does not yet have a keyframe. In the context menu, you can add 1, 10 or even 100 random keyframes. Now I decide for 10. The green 0 has turned into a green 10 and the click on Run Halt starts it immediately. The keyframes pass through what you see on the display and then the oscillator stops. A keyframe is a snapshot of a sound, as it can be seen in the display. However, some parameters of them can also be set. TOT time is the total time of all keyframes. Current keyframe shows which keyframe is currently playing. I can also select one here, otherwise you can simply see the change in numbers here. With cur, KF, del, only the displayed KF is deleted. Each KF can have a different duration, and this is defined in the field cur KF time for the current keyframe or next KF time for the following keyframe. This works as always with a click on the number to be changed and a move up or down. Snap KF creates a new empty keyframe which can be filled with the current screen content, for example. In the context menu, there is the option Save Screen to Current Frame for this. With Load Current Frame to Screen, you can load a previously created keyframe into the display. Run halts, starts and stops the keyframes. Pause cont stops the playback and restarts it at the stopped location. Reset resets the counter back to keyframe 1. And with loop, the series of keyframes is repeated again and again. Except for loop, all of these buttons also have a trigger input to automate their functions. And I'm actually done with that monster module. Try it yourself, it is certainly not the easiest module, but worth every effort. Finally, I now have an oscillator that could well be described as the opposite of phasor. But that doesn't mean anything about the quality. We are talking about a messed up oscillator from Rodent Modules. You could call him a minimalist, and in any case he immediately catches the eye with his comic design. But he's not a beeping rodent, he can roar quite well. Unlike many other modules, it is tuned to A 440 Hz, and its range is from A1 to A7. I can see its range in the bass range, which is why I also choose the low pitch, which also makes it easier to see the waveform. This is a mixture of sawtooth and sine and can be modulated with the controller M. This causes the waveform to be folded and slightly distorted. And this can be controlled via CV. Next to the pitch control is the volt per octave input, and that's it. A simple oscillator with an interesting basic sound, which certainly has its field of application. And that was episode 8, which is probably not so easy to digest today. My recommendation: let it work and then grab the modules yourself and try them out for yourself. As always, you will find links to the most important websites and also to the developers of the modules presented this time. I am looking forward to your feedback, no matter if wishes, suggestions or a criticism. And not to forget, many thanks to Andrew Belt and all the module developers without whom this would not be possible. That's it from me. Have a good time. Servus.